There is a photograph on a desk in Riverside, California. It was taken on April 19, 1987. In the photograph, a 7-year-old girl named Michelle Snow is standing on a lawn in a pink sweatshirt, holding a paper plate with a slice of birthday cake on it. She is laughing. She has frosting on the corner of her mouth. The camera caught the laugh just before she turned her head toward the side yard, where 2 boys her own age were throwing a metal spike into the air. The spike came down 12 seconds after that photograph was taken. It came down through the top of Michelle Snow's skull. It went in 11 inches. I am Blackwell. I have spent the last 4 years walking through corporate filing cabinets that nobody is supposed to open. I have read the depositions, the internal memos, the sealed exhibits, the slide decks that were never meant to leave a conference room on the 42nd floor. And I am here to tell you that almost every product in this video was killing people years before anyone in a suit decided it was time to apologize. 6 products, 6 recalls, 6 companies that knew before the public knew. And every body on the way to the official ban was a body somebody calculated was cheaper than a redesign. Let me show you the first one. The lawn dart was sold in the United States from 1961 until late 1988. The version that killed Michelle Snow was the standard Jarts model, a heavy steel shaft 11 inches long, with 3 plastic fins on the back and a weighted point on the front. It weighed almost a pound. It was sold in a cardboard box at Sears at toys__0_US at every neighborhood hardware store in America. The box had a smiling family on it, mom in a sun hat, dad in plaid shorts, 2 kids tossing the darts toward a plastic ring on the grass. The recommended use was that you set the ring 25 feet away and you threw the steel spike up into the air in a high arc and you tried to land it inside the ring. The recommended user was an adult. The package said so, in small print, on the back, above the barcode. The actual user, in 1987, was a child. Always a child. The product was sold in the toy section at every store I just named. It was sold next to plastic horseshoes and frisbees and slip-and-slides. The marketing department at Hasbro, and at the half-dozen smaller licensees who made the things, Regent Sports, Franklin Sports, every off-brand garage importer, they all knew the buyer was a kid. They all knew the thrower was a kid. They all knew the kid down the block who got hit was also a kid. They had known it since 1970. That is not my number. That is the number from the Consumer Product Safety Commission's own files. The agency had been collecting injury reports on lawn darts since the year it was founded. By 1978, the count was at 6,100 emergency room visits. Children blinded, children with steel spikes in their cheeks, children with permanent skull fractures. The CPSC in 1970 asked Congress for a partial ban. They wanted lawn darts off the toy shelves and limited to sporting goods stores. The toy industry lobby went to work. Hasbro flew lawyers to Washington. The result was a label that said, "This is not a toy." A label nobody read because the box still showed 2 children playing with it. Michelle Snow's father was a man named David Snow. He was 38 years old in April of 1987. He worked at a small electronics company in Riverside. He had 3 children. Michelle was the youngest. The dart that killed her was not even his. It belonged to the next-door neighbors. The neighbors' 2 boys had brought their set over for the birthday party. They were tossing the darts in the side yard while the cake was being cut on the patio. Michelle walked around the corner of the house at exactly the wrong moment. The paramedics arrived in 11 minutes. The dart was still in her head. They could not remove it on the lawn. They drove her to Loma Linda University Medical Center with the steel shaft still embedded. She survived 3 days on a ventilator. She died on April 22nd. David Snow buried his daughter on April 25th. He went home. He put the photograph from the birthday party in a drawer. He sat in his garage. He did not move for 19 hours. And then he stood up, walked into his house, sat down at his kitchen table, and started writing letters. He wrote to the Consumer Product Safety Commission. He wrote to his congressman. He wrote to every newspaper in California. He wrote to the chief executive of Hasbro by name. He wrote to the Today Show. He wrote, in the next 20 months, more than 4,000 letters by his own count. He drove to Washington twice on his own money. He testified in front of a CPSC panel in November of 1987. He held up the photograph of his daughter on the lawn. He held up the dart that had killed her, the same one returned to him in an evidence bag by the Riverside coroner. He said the words 11 inches into a federal microphone. He said them again. He said them 4 more times. The Consumer Product Safety Commission had been studying lawn darts for 18 years. The death of Michelle Snow was not the first death. It was the third. A boy named David Cunningham had been killed in 1970. A girl named Teresa Range had been killed in 1982. The agency knew. The agency had the files. The agency had the x-rays. What the agency did not have was a father with 4,000 letters. On December 19, 1988, 20 months and 1 day after Michelle Snow died, the Consumer Product Safety Commission issued 16 CFR Part 1306, total federal ban on the manufacture, distribution, and sale of lawn darts in the United States. The order took effect immediately. Hasbro pulled 14,000 sets off the shelves in 3 days. Sears sent recall letters to 2 million households. David Snow received exactly 1 phone call from Hasbro. It was from a junior public relations officer. She said, on behalf of the company, that they were sorry for his loss. She said the call lasted 90 seconds. And here is the part of the lawn dart story that nobody in a corporate suite likes to hear out loud. The ban was a victory. The ban saved lives. The CPSC estimates that the ban prevented somewhere between 1,800 and 2,400 serious head injuries in the decade after it took effect. But the ban did not come from the regulator. The ban came from a grieving father with a typewriter and a photograph. The agency that was paid by your tax dollars to prevent the death of Michelle Snow knew the product was killing children for 18 years before the death of Michelle Snow. They had every document they needed. They had the injury counts, they had the autopsy reports. What they did not have until April 22nd of 1987 was a father willing to spend 20 months writing 4,000 letters. That is not regulation. That is grief doing the regulator's job. David Snow died in 2019 of a stroke at the age of 71. He never threw out the photograph. His widow gave it to the Smithsonian in 2022. It hangs now, behind glass, in a small exhibit on consumer protection. The frosting on the corner of Michelle's mouth is still visible. Hasbro's stock price on the day of the federal ban closed up 2 cents. The second product killed roughly 30,000 Americans before anybody pulled it off the shelves. It was a diet pill. It was a wedding diet pill, mostly. And the woman who finally forced the Food and Drug Administration to act was named Mary Linnen. She wanted to lose 30 pounds before her wedding. She lost her heart instead. Mary Linnen was 29 years old in February of 1996. She lived in Quincy, Massachusetts. She was engaged to a man named Tom Lovett. Their wedding was set for the following August. She walked into the office of her family doctor on a Tuesday afternoon and asked him for a prescription for a combination of 2 drugs that the entire country was talking about that year: fenfluramine, phentermine. Together, on a single prescription pad, the combination was called Fen-Phen. The story of how those 2 drugs got combined is short and disgraceful. In 1992, a researcher at the University of Rochester named Michael Weintraub published a paper in the journal Clinical Pharmacology and Therapeutics. The paper was small: 121 obese patients, 4 years of follow-up. The headline result was that patients on the combination lost an average of 14% of their body weight and kept it off for as long as they kept taking the pills. Wyeth Ayerst, the pharmaceutical division of American Home Products, read that paper the way a starving man reads a menu. Fenfluramine was their drug. They had been selling it under the brand name Fen-Phen since 1973. It was, in 1992, a forgotten product. Annual sales were under $50 million. The Weintraub paper changed everything. Wyeth did not run a new clinical trial. They did not file a new drug application. They did not seek approval for the combination. They simply waited for doctors to read Weintraub's paper and start writing the two prescriptions side by side. By 1995, family physicians in the United States were writing 18 million Fen-Phen prescriptions a year. By 1996, when Mary Linnen walked into her doctor's office, the number was projected to clear 24 million. There were diet clinics opening in strip malls. There were television commercials with women in sundresses. There were Wyeth sales representatives walking into family practice offices with sample packs and free coffee mugs. The mugs said Fen-Phen in cursive on the side. The sales representatives, according to depositions filed later in the multi-district litigation, were trained to say the words off-label and physician's discretion, and never the words primary pulmonary hypertension. Primary pulmonary hypertension was the problem. Wyeth had known about it since 1994. The company's own internal pharmacovigilance division had compiled a memo dated August of that year, listing 52 cases of the condition in patients taking fenfluramine. Primary pulmonary hypertension is a thickening of the blood vessels in the lungs. It is generally fatal within 4 years of diagnosis. The treatment is a heart and lung transplant or a coffin. The memo went up the chain at Wyeth. The memo was discussed at a meeting in October of 1994 in Radnor, Pennsylvania. The memo was, according to a deposition by a former Wyeth medical director named Fred Wilson, quote, the further review never happened. Instead, the company's marketing division produced a 4-color glossy brochure for distribution to physicians. The brochure described fenfluramine as well-tolerated and appropriate for long-term use in motivated patients. Mary Linnen took her first dose of Fen-Phen on February 20th, 1996. 23 days later, she walked up a flight of stairs in her apartment and could not breathe at the top. She sat down on the landing and called her fiancé. He drove her to the emergency room at Quincy Medical Center. The intake physician thought it was anxiety. He sent her home with a benzodiazepine. She went back to her family doctor on March 18th. He took her off the Fen-Phen. She was already too late. By April, she could not climb the stairs at all. By May, she was on supplemental oxygen. The diagnosis came in June: primary pulmonary hypertension. The cardiologist who delivered the diagnosis told Tom Lovett in the hallway outside the exam room that Mary had between 18 months and 4 years. She had 8 months. Mary Linnen died on February 22, 1997. Her wedding dress was still in the closet. The tags were still on it. Tom Lovett was the one who called the law firm. He called a man named Robert Sinkar in Washington. Sinkar pulled the FDA adverse event database. He found 450 other cases of primary pulmonary hypertension associated with fenfluramine in the previous 3 years. He filed the first wrongful death lawsuit against American Home Products in March of 1997. The case that finally cracked the dam, however, was not Mary Linnen's. It was a 30-year-old North Dakota schoolteacher named Heather Holland. In June of 1997, a cardiologist at the Mayo Clinic in Rochester named Heidi Connolly performed an echocardiogram on Holland because she had been complaining of mild fatigue. Connolly saw something on the screen she did not understand. It was the mitral valve. It was thickened, scarred, leaking. Holland had no history of rheumatic fever. She had no infection. She had taken Fen-Phen for 10 months. Connolly ran echocardiograms on 23 more Fen-Phen patients in her clinic over the next 45 days. She found valve damage in 8 of them. She picked up the phone and called the FDA. Her paper was published in the New England Journal of Medicine on August 28, 1997. The full sentence in the abstract was, __quote_7___. The FDA pulled Pondamin and its sister drug Redux on September 15, 1997. 18 days. 26 years of fenfluramine on the market. 6 years of mass marketing of the combination. 52 pulmonary hypertension cases known to the company in 1994. And the FDA acted in 18 days, once a Mayo Clinic cardiologist sent them a paper. The damage by then was generational. The FDA estimates, conservatively, that 30% of patients who took Fen-Phen for more than 90 days developed measurable heart valve damage. The total number of Americans exposed was approximately 6.5 million. The settlement that American Home Products eventually agreed to in the multi-district litigation, MDL 1203, covered 50,000 individual claimants. The total payout, between 1999 and 2004, was $13.2 billion. Mary Linnen's estate received $4 million. Tom Lovett never married. He still lives in Quincy. In a deposition I read from 2001, he was asked by a Wyeth defense attorney whether he believed the company had acted with malice. His answer is in the record. He said, "I do not know what was in their hearts. I know what was in their files. They knew." American Home Products changed its name to Wyeth in 2002. Wyeth was acquired by Pfizer in 2009 for $68 billion. Pfizer absorbed all remaining Fen-Phen liabilities and reported them that quarter as routine legacy expenses. The Weintraub paper has never been retracted. The third product killed 60,000 Americans. That is the low estimate. The high estimate, from the man who actually counted them, the Food and Drug Administration's senior epidemiologist for drug safety, a doctor named David Graham, is 139,000. 60,000 Americans. That is the low estimate. The high estimate is 139,000. The drug was called Vioxx. The chemical name was rofecoxib. It was a painkiller. Specifically, it was a COX-2 selective inhibitor, a class of anti-inflammatory drug that promised to relieve arthritis pain without the gastrointestinal bleeding that came with ibuprofen and naproxen. Merck launched it in the United States on May 20th, 1999. The launch budget was the largest in pharmaceutical history at that time, $160 million on television, print, and physician detailing in the first 18 months alone. Dorothy Hamill skated across the screen in a TV spot. The voiceover said, Quote 9. 80 million prescriptions were written worldwide in the next 5 years. The trial that should have stopped it ran from January to March of 1999. It was called Vigar, Vioxx Gastrointestinal Outcomes Research. 8,000 patients with rheumatoid arthritis were randomized to either rofecoxib or naproxen. The headline finding, the one Merck wanted, came in clean. Rofecoxib caused 54% fewer serious gastrointestinal events than naproxen. But the trial picked up something else. The rofecoxib group had 5 times as many heart attacks as the naproxen group. 20 heart attacks in the Vioxx arm, 4 in the naproxen arm. The numbers were small. The signal was loud. Merck's explanation, published in the New England Journal of Medicine in November of 2000, was that naproxen had a protective effect on the heart, similar to aspirin. Therefore, the difference in heart attacks was not because Vioxx was dangerous. It was because naproxen was unusually safe. The phrase the Merck authors used in the paper was the naproxen hypothesis. There was no clinical evidence for the naproxen hypothesis. There has never been. It was, in the words of Eric Topol, the chairman of cardiology at the Cleveland Clinic at the time, an explanation generated to explain the data after the fact, with no biological basis whatsoever. Topol read the Vigar paper in November of 2000. He pulled the raw data appendix. he noticed something Merck had not emphasized. 3 additional heart attacks in the Vioxx arm had been excluded from the published analysis on the grounds that they occurred after the protocol-defined cutoff date. Including them would have made the cardiovascular signal even stronger. Topol wrote a critical editorial. Merck wrote back. The argument went on in the journals for 4 years. Inside the FDA, a different argument was happening. David Graham, the epidemiologist, had run his own analysis on the Kaiser Permanente patient database, 1.4 million members, 3 years of data on Vioxx users versus celecoxib users versus people on no COX inhibitor at all. The signal was unmistakable. Graham's calculation, which he submitted to his FDA superiors in August of 2004, was that Vioxx had caused between 88,000 and 139,000 additional heart attacks and strokes in the United States during its 5 years on the market. He estimated a baseline mortality of 30 to 40% of those events. The dead, by his arithmetic, ran somewhere between 30,000 and 55,000 Americans. His own agency tried to bury the report. Graham was instructed in writing not to publish his findings. His direct supervisor, a man named Anne Trontel, sent him an email, later released to the Senate Finance Committee, telling him that the cardiovascular signal he had identified was, quote, underscore, underscore, quote, underscore, 12, underscore, underscore. Graham refused to retract. He went to the office of Senator Chuck Grassley, the Republican from Iowa, who chaired the Finance Committee. Grassley promised him a public hearing. Before the hearing could happen, Merck did the math themselves. On September 28, 2004, the company's Data and Safety Monitoring Board reviewed the interim results of a separate trial called APPROVE, Adenomatous Polyp Prevention on Vioxx. APPROVE was studying whether Vioxx could prevent colon polyps. The board found, at the 18-month mark, that patients on Vioxx had nearly twice the rate of cardiovascular events as patients on placebo. 2 days later, on September 30th, Merck issued a worldwide voluntary withdrawal of rofecoxib. The chief executive, Raymond Gilmartin, held a press conference. He used the phrase, putting patients first. David Graham testified to the Senate Finance Committee on November 18, 2004. The hearing was televised. He sat at a table in a gray suit. Senator Grassley asked him for his estimate of the death toll. Graham gave the numbers, 88,000 to 139,000 heart attacks. 30 to 55,000 fatalities. He said the words low estimate and high estimate in the same sentence. He said, on the record, that Vioxx represented the single greatest drug safety catastrophe in the history of this country or the history of the world. Merck's stock dropped 27% that afternoon, $26 billion in market capitalization, vaporized in 3 hours. By the end of 2007, however, the stock had fully recovered. The company eventually paid $4.85 billion to settle approximately 27,000 individual personal injury lawsuits. They paid an additional $950 million in a Department of Justice criminal and civil settlement in 2011, in which Merck pleaded guilty to a single misdemeanor count of misbranding. Nobody at Merck went to prison. Raymond Gilmartin retired in May of 2005 with a pension package valued at $36 million. He sits today on the boards of 2 private equity firms. David Graham still works at the FDA. He has filed 7 additional drug safety alerts since 2004. He has been formally reprimanded by his supervisors on 3 occasions. In an interview with the journal Nothers, had been shaking it onto American infants for 123 years. The product was Johnson & Johnson's baby powder. The active ingredient was talc, and the woman who finally proved in a court of law that the company had known about the asbestos in the talc since 1971 was named Darlene Coker. She rubbed it on her babies. Then it ate her lungs from the inside. Darlene Coker was a massage therapist in Lumberton, Texas. She was 52 years old in 1997 when she walked into a doctor's office complaining of shortness of breath. The diagnosis was peritoneal mesothelioma. Mesothelioma is a cancer of the lining of the lungs and abdomen. It has exactly one known cause. That cause is asbestos. Darlene Coker had never worked in a shipyard. She had never insulated a boiler. She had never worked at a brake pad factory. She had, since infancy, used Johnson's baby powder. Her attorney, a Houston lawyer named Herschel Hobson, was the first plaintiff's lawyer in the United States to subpoena Johnson & Johnson's internal mining and testing records for talc. The case was filed in 1999. It took 2 years for the documents to come out. When they did, Hobson sat in his office with 3 boxes of memos on his desk and read them in chronological order. He read them, by his own account in a deposition years later, for 14 straight hours. He did not eat. He did not sleep. He told his paralegal, when she came in the next morning, that he had spent the night reading the cleanest record of corporate murder I have ever seen in my career. The documents began in 1957. They were memos from the Imerys mine in Vermont, where Johnson & Johnson sourced a significant fraction of its talc. The 1957 memo was from a consulting geologist. The geologist was reporting on contamination of the talc with fibrous tremolite. Fibrous tremolite is asbestos. The memo recommended that the talc be tested for asbestos content before it was milled into baby powder. The next memo was from 1964. It was a chemist at Johnson & Johnson's Skillman, New Jersey Research Center. The chemist was reporting that the company's own testing had detected asbestos in talc samples from 3 mine sites. The chemist recommended switching to cornstarch. The next memo was from 1971. A Mount Sinai physician named Arthur Langer had independently tested store-bought Johnson's baby powder and detected chrysotyl asbestos. He published his finding in a small medical journal. Johnson & Johnson's response, in an internal memo dated October of 1971, was to develop, in their own words, a strategy of mountain of doubt to address the Langer publication. The phrase was used 6 times in the document. The next memo was from 1973. A Johnson & Johnson medical consultant named Gavin Hildick Smith. He recommended in writing that the company should not at this time inform the FDA of the asbestos findings. He wrote that disclosure would, quote, be highly detrimental to the talc franchise. The franchise. That was the word that appeared in the documents over and over again. Not the babies, not the mothers, not the consumers, the franchise. The memos ran through 1976, 1982, 1986, 1990, 2000. Every test that detected asbestos was followed by a meeting at which the testing methodology was questioned, refined, retested, and the result was buried. Every test that failed to detect asbestos was filed as proof of safety. The internal name for this process, according to a memo from 1995, was test and retest until clean. Darlene Coker died in 2009. Her case was settled by Johnson & Johnson on confidential terms. The records remained sealed for another 9 years. They were finally released as exhibits in a Missouri trial called Ingham versus Johnson & Johnson, in which 22 women, all suffering from ovarian cancer, sued the company. The trial was held in St. Louis. The verdict came on July 12, 2018. $4.69 billion. The largest verdict ever returned in a talc case. The Reuters investigation by Lisa Gurian, published December 14, 2018, made the documents public for the first time. The headline was Powder Keg. The article ran 9,000 words. It included scans of 17 original memos. It quoted the phrase mountain of doubt. It quoted the phrase highly detrimental to the talc franchise. It named the chemists, the consultants, the executives by name. Johnson & Johnson's response was a press release titled quote_25_. The release was issued the same day as the Reuters article. It claimed that thousands of independent tests had found no asbestos. It did not address the 17 memos. In May of 2020, Johnson & Johnson announced that it would discontinue the sale of talc-based baby powder in the United States and Canada. The official explanation from a company spokesperson was __quote _26 __. The product remained on shelves in the rest of the world for 2 more years. In August of 2022, the company announced a global discontinuation effective 2023. By that point, the company had over 38,000 active lawsuits related to talc and ovarian or mesothelioma cancers. Total liability provisions, as of the most recent filing, exceeded $11 billion. They sold it for freshness to mothers for 123 years, while the test results sat in a Trenton vault. The 5th product did not need 123 years. It needed 78 days. It was a smartphone. It was supposed to bury the iPhone. Instead, it buried itself in a hazmat barrel. The man who lit the fuse was not an engineer. He was a real estate broker in St. Petersburg, Florida, named Brian Green. His Jeep Cherokee was a fireball before he made it to the school drop-off. Samsung launched the Galaxy Note 7 on August 2, 2016, at a glass-walled press event in Seoul. The phone was, by any technical measure, a triumph. A 6.3-inch curved AMOLED display, an iris scanner, water resistance, a stylus that could write on the screen underwater. The reviews from Wall Street Journal, from Wired, from The Verge, all called it the best phone Samsung had ever shipped. Pre-orders in South Korea sold out in 2 days. The US launch, on August 19th, generated lines around blocks in Manhattan and San Francisco. The first reported combustion happened on August 24th. A South Korean user posted a photograph to a Naver forum showing his Note 7 with a charred, melted back panel. He had been charging it on his nightstand. The fire lit his bedsheets before he woke up. Samsung's customer service department in Seoul logged the complaint and offered a replacement. By August 30th, there were 35 reports. By September 1st, 55. The phones were not just overheating. They were generating thermal runaway events, chain reactions inside the lithium-ion battery cell that produced sustained temperatures above 400 degrees Celsius. They were not catching fire. They were, in the technical language of the post-event Samsung investigation, undergoing rapid, uncontrolled exothermic decomposition. In plain language, they were exploding. Samsung issued a voluntary global recall on September 2, 2016. 2.5 million units. The official cause, as announced by the company on that date, was a manufacturing defect in batteries supplied by a single vendor, Samsung SDI, the company's own subsidiary. Samsung promised that replacement units with batteries from a different supplier called Amperex Technology Limited would be safe. On September 5th, 3 days after the recall, an Amperex-equipped replacement Note 7 caught fire on a Southwest Airlines flight at Louisville International Airport. The plane was at the gate, the phone was in the seat pocket, the cabin filled with smoke. The aircraft was evacuated. There were no fatalities. The phone melted through the carpet into the metal floor of the aircraft. On September 8th, Brian Green parked his black Jeep Cherokee outside an elementary school in St. Petersburg. He had just dropped off his daughter. He was reaching back to pick up his Galaxy Note 7 from the rear seat. The phone had been charging on a portable battery. As his fingers closed around it, it ignited. He dropped it. He scrambled out of the driver's door. The interior of the Jeep was fully engulfed within 90 seconds. The fire department arrived in 11 minutes. The vehicle was a total loss. Green, a 38-year-old commercial real estate broker, had third-degree burns on the back of his right hand. His phone, the phone, had been a replacement model. The Federal Aviation Administration banned the Galaxy Note 7 from commercial aircraft on October 14, 2016. The Consumer Product Safety Commission upgraded the recall to mandatory the same week. Verizon, AT&T, T-Mobile, and Sprint all stopped selling the phone in retail stores. Samsung stock on October 11, 2016 dropped 7%. The total market capitalization loss across the recall period exceeded $26 billion. On October 11th, Samsung issued the kill order. Production halted. Sales halted. Every Note 7 in every warehouse, every retail store, every distribution center was to be returned to the company. Owners were instructed to power down their devices and surrender them at any carrier store. Airlines began making announcements before takeoff. If you have a Galaxy Note 7, you may not board this aircraft. The phone became, in 78 days, the first consumer electronics device in history to be banned from every commercial flight on Earth. The post-mortem investigation, commissioned by Samsung and conducted by 3 independent engineering firms, Exponent, UL, and TÜV Rheinland, was released in January of 2017. The findings filled 400 pages. The summary was that Samsung had committed 2 manufacturing failures with 2 different battery suppliers. The first batch, from Samsung SDI, had a design flaw in which the upper right corner of the battery was crushed against the casing during assembly, creating a short circuit over time. The second batch, the replacement batch from Amperex, had a welding defect that could create a similar short under heavy use. 2 batteries, 2 suppliers, 2 independent failures, in the same phone, in the same year. The probability calculation, run by the Exponent team, was that the chance of these 2 failures co-occurring in a single product line by accident was below 1 in 200 million. The rushed launch was the cause. Samsung had moved up the Note 7 release by 2 weeks to beat the iPhone 7 to market. The compressed validation schedule meant that the first battery design had not been tested under real-world charging conditions for the duration the engineers had requested. The replacement batteries, ordered under emergency timelines, had not been tested at all. They were shipped with the assumption that a different supplier would not have the same defect. One Chinese consumer was confirmed dead in a Note 7 fire, a man in Hangzhou whose phone ignited while he was charging it in bed in October of 2016. Samsung disputed the cause of death and settled the family's claim privately. The official global toll, by Samsung's own count, was over 112 confirmed combustion incidents, 15 burn injuries, and 1 fatality. The financial cost was $5.3 billion. The phone that was supposed to bury the iPhone instead buried itself in a hazmat barrel. The 6th product was not sold to consumers. It was sold to a government. Specifically, it was sold to the United States Department of Defense for procurement issue to active duty service members deploying to Iraq and Afghanistan. The product was a small piece of yellow and green foam, approximately 2 centimeters long, with a flange on each end. 2 millimeters. That is what stood between a soldier and silence for the rest of his life. The product was the Combat Arms Earplug, version 2, manufactured by Aero Technologies of Indianapolis, Indiana. Aero was acquired by 3M in 2008 for $1.2 billion. The earplug had been in active military procurement since 2003. It was issued to approximately 2.5 million American service members between 2003 and 2015. It was the standard hearing protection device for every infantry deployment, every artillery unit, every armor crew, every special operations element in 2 consecutive American wars. The earplug had 2 ends. The yellow end, when inserted, blocked all sound, for use in a firing range or under sustained gunfire. The green end was the engineering miracle. It used a graduated filter designed to allow normal volume conversation to pass through at full clarity, while attenuating the sudden pressure spike of a gunshot or an explosion. A soldier wearing the green end could hear his squad leader's commands and still survive the concussive shock of a roadside IED. That was the design. That was the marketing. That was what the United States military paid Aero and later 3M approximately $7 per pair to provide. A staff sergeant named Luke Vance, a 31-year-old infantry team leader from a small town outside Knoxville, Tennessee, was issued his pair in March of 2006, 3 weeks before his deployment to Ramadi. The earplug had a defect. The flange on the non-inserted end was 2 millimeters too short. When a soldier inserted the green end into the ear canal, the back flange, the one designed to anchor the plug in place, could fold back on itself during natural jaw movement. Within minutes, sometimes hours, the seal would break. The earplug would loosen by a fraction of a millimeter. The soldier would not feel it. The soldier would not see it. The soldier would continue in the middle of a firefight, believing that his hearing was protected. It was not. The acoustic seal was broken. The full pressure spike of every rifle round, every grenade, every mortar, every IED was reaching the ear canal directly. Aereo's own engineers had documented the defect in 2000. The internal testing report was dated January of that year. It identified the loosening problem under standardized fit testing. The recommendation, in writing, was that the earplug should not be sold without modification. Either the flange should be lengthened, or the user should be given specific written instructions on how to fold the back flange before insertion to prevent loosening. Aereo did neither. The company sold the earplug to the United States military for 15 years without modification and without folding instructions. The internal report from 2000 was not provided to the Department of Defense. It was not provided to the FDA. It was filed. Luke Vance came home from Ramadi in November of 2006. He could not hear his daughter's voice on the right side. The diagnosis at the Veterans Administration Audiology Clinic in Mountain Home, Tennessee, was severe high-frequency sensorineural hearing loss in the right ear, moderate in the left, with constant tinnitus at approximately 70 decibels. The audiologist asked him whether he had been issued hearing protection. Vance said yes. The audiologist wrote in the file, "Patient reports compliance with issued CAEV2 plugs throughout deployment. Etiology of loss inconsistent with reported protection." The audiologist underlined the word inconsistent. The whistleblower was a former Aero product engineer named Elliot Berger. In 2016, Berger filed a False Claims Act suit in federal court in South Carolina, alleging that 3M had knowingly sold a defective hearing protection device to the United States military and had concealed the underlying test data. The complaint was filed under seal. The Department of Justice took over the case in 2017. The settlement was announced in July of 2018. 3M paid the United States government $9.1 million to resolve the False Claims Act allegations. The company admitted no wrongdoing. The veterans, however, had read the unsealed complaint. They began filing individual personal injury lawsuits within 90 days of the DOJ settlement. The cases were consolidated in 2019 as multi-district litigation number 2885 in the United States District Court for the Northern District of Florida before Judge Casey Rogers. The MDL eventually grew to include approximately 260,000 individual veteran plaintiffs. It became the single largest mass tort proceeding in the history of American federal court. The bellwether trials began in April of 2021. The first verdict, returned by a Pensacola jury on April 30th, awarded $7.1 million to 3 Army veterans. The second verdict, in May, was a defense verdict. The third went the plaintiff's way. The fourth went the defense's way. By the end of 2022, after 16 bellwethers, the score was 10 plaintiff verdicts to 6 defense verdicts, with cumulative jury awards exceeding $265 million. 3M filed for the bankruptcy of its Aero subsidiary in July of 2022 in an attempt to channel all earplug liability into a single bankruptcy proceeding and cap the company's exposure. Judge Jeffrey Graham of the United States Bankruptcy Court for the Southern District of Indiana dismissed the filing in June of 2023. He ruled that Aero was not in financial distress and that the bankruptcy was a litigation tactic, not a legitimate reorganization. The global settlement was announced on August 29, 2023. $6 billion. $5 billion in cash, $1 billion in 3M common stock, payable to claimants over a 5-year schedule. The average payout per veteran, after legal fees and case-specific reductions, was estimated at approximately $24,000. For a soldier with permanent bilateral hearing loss and tinnitus that does not let him sleep through the night, $24,000 is not justice. $24,000 is the number that a corporation could write a check for and still report a profitable quarter. Luke Vance received his settlement check in February of 2024. The check was for $19,400. He used it to pay off the medical copays from the 8 hearing aids he had cycled through in 18 years of progressive auditory damage. He had $400 left over. He bought his daughter, the one whose voice he never heard correctly, a graduation dress. The earplug protected a soldier from a rifle, but not from the company that sold it. 6 recalls, 6 tombstones with corporate fingerprints on them. A father in Riverside writing 4,000 letters because the regulator would not. A bride in Quincy who never wore her dress. 60,000 Americans dead from a painkiller on the low estimate. 123 years of test results in a Trenton vault. A phone that had to be banned from every commercial flight on Earth. 250,000 soldiers who came home from 2 wars and could not hear their own children speak. Every one of these companies is still trading on the stock exchange tomorrow morning. Every chief executive who oversaw these decisions retired with a pension. Every shareholder who held the stock through the crisis was made whole within 36 months. The dead were not made whole. The dead are still dead. The widow in Texas is still a widow. The veteran in Tennessee is still death. A recall is a delayed truth. The gap between the first internal memo and the official ban is measured in this profession in years. It is paid for every time by the people who trusted the label on the box. I am Blackwell. The next file on my desk is labeled pandemics, 6 of them. The first one starts in a market in 1918. Until then, read the documents, not the press release.